My name is Cole Barrett, and this presentation is titled Learning Theories in E-Learning and How They Apply to My Classroom. Again, this is Cole Barrett. This is a project for 520 with Professor O'Neill at Cal State Fullerton. The essential question of this specific uh, endeavor is which learning theories between constructivism, cognitivism, and behaviorism would work best in my classroom if I were to ever go back to a 100% online room. In March of 2020, this happened, and this was my first year of teaching, and I didn't quite know where to go, and I'd like to be more prepared. Now, these theories are beneficial in an in-person class as technology becomes more integrated, so it also goes to benefit that. But in general, I want this project to not only serve as an assignment that I'm completing for this class, but also a guide or a resource that I can look back upon in the future. With this presentation, we will define the theories of constructivism, behaviorism, and cognitivism. We will apply each theory to e-learning and then a hypothetical lesson in my class in an online setting. And then I will evaluate each theory to see which one I find the most useful in my lesson planning. I actually do pick one that I find very interesting. And we're going to start off with constructivism. Now, according to constructivism, learning is done through a very active construction of new knowledge and meaning. And this is usually meaning based on subjective experiences that students bring into the classroom. And this is also done in a social setting, in a discussion deliberative setting where the teacher is the facilitator rather than the students acting in a passive setting. This is a more modern approach to education where the teacher is this facilitator of the experience and the students then engage in their own way, bringing their own prior knowledge to the classroom. And so this is actually kind of a departure where, typically traditionally the teacher is the genius on the pedestal that the students just kind of copy. Ertmer and Newby actually argue that this is a much more subjective approach rather than a one-size-fits-all traditional approach. And Zhu actually agrees that objectivism and constructivism are really on opposite sides of the spectrum. Hong goes even further to state that the rise of constructivism in education is a direct challenge to this traditional approach. And to be honest, I've seen this personally on both ends. I've seen older teachers struggle with this new phenomena of being the facilitator, and I've also seen students struggle with having a greater responsibility in their education. In e-learning, it sounds like with constructivism, communication is everything. Zhu describes constructivism as a series of activation, discussion, and feedback. And either in a synchronous or an asynchronous setting, the establishment of communication is completely invaluable if you're going from a constructivist standpoint. This could mean discussion boards, open-ended problems, group work that involves deliberation, perhaps a debate or a disagreement, different anticipatory sets. This could really be anything that involves heavy communication between two parties, whether the students or the teacher and the students. Okta and a few other authors agree and they actually argue that online education should embrace this constructivism due to the hyper social nature of the internet. However, Steele talks about constructivism in a way that role playing is this huge part of it. And I kind of find that role playing would be pretty difficult in a more asynchronous setting. If I had a class where the students kind of check in whenever they want to, how do I start a role playing setting? So that's something I would have a challenge with constructivism. But in general, the formula seems to be activate, uh, activate interest and prior knowledge, then engage in a teacher-led discussion that the students then take off, construct knowledge and access, and then assess the acquisition. The teacher then provides feedback, and then we have a time for reflection. Now, in my online class, let's say that I have my psychology class goes online, and I'm teaching a lesson on the ethics of gene editing. What I would start with is an open-ended objective. The verb is not going to be identify or define. It's going to be argue, create. I'm looking for an anticipatory set that engages prior knowledge that we can then discuss and then link to gene editing. Um, I would then present the pros and cons, the pros and possibilities of gene editing, and then allow for discussion. I would then present the cons of and the ethical concerns of gene editing and then allow for discussion. You see, there's a lot of reflection in this. There's a lot of, well, I think this is good. I think this is bad. I would actually assume that most of the students could assume what the good and the bad were. and then we discuss and deliberate with immediate feedback of, okay, did they acquire the knowledge of the ethical concerns of gene editing? Moving on to behaviorism. Behaviorism, I like to just automatically think of the famous examples such as Skinner's box or Pavlov's dogs, where learning is demonstrated as observable behaviors acquired through a series of repetitious conditioning. But in a classroom, this really looks like the more traditional direct instruction, with an emphasis on practice and feedback, but pretty much the teacher is the presenter of information, with an assessment that is based on observable performance. This is actually considered very passive. Steele called this traditional passive, more along the lines of direct instruction, and it's open to modern criticisms. But Steele actually argues, especially for kids with special needs, that there are some positive outcomes still with behavioristic approaches in this traditional worldview. So this consideration is still warranted, absolutely. In e-learning, this is probably the easiest one to apply. In fact, when March of 2020 happened, this is what all the teachers kind of defaulted to until they got a little more experimental. This looks like traditional direct instruction. However, with e-learning, we got to talk about instant feedback, and this is kind of where I think e-learning has a little bit of an advantage, because I've seen automated feedback be very, very successful. But if I'm designing a lesson for an online class, there is still a model, and this is a classic teacher model of I do, we do, and then you do. And here's what that looks like. Let's say that I'm teaching how to write a thesis statement in my AP US history class. The behaviorist considerations is, okay, what's the I do, what's the we do, and what's the you do? Well, the I do would be, all right, here's a thesis formula to break down what I want you to repeat for your thesis. Here's examples of an acceptable thesis statement. I do that. Here's examples of unacceptable thesis statements. Don't do that. I then have a we do session where I provide a graphic organizer and students produce their thesis statements with this organizer with instant feedback. But then as the semester continues, there's a progressive removal of these scaffolds. And that brings us to you do. And this would be the behavioristic approach. And of course, in between this, there's a series of conditionings, rewards, yays, good jobs, along with some, not so much penalties, but consequences for doing the wrong thing. Which brings us to cognitivism. And this one I saved for last solely because this is a little bit more theoretical and abstract than behaviorism or constructivism. I actually had a pretty difficult time, really trying to understand how this directly applies to a classroom, because this is kind of about what's not seen. A cognitivist would argue that learning should have a greater focus on the mental processes that lead to acquired knowledge. Behaviorism talks about observable, but this is more the unobservable. In fact, Clark says, quote, "It is less about what learners do," which would be behaviorism, "and more about what they know and how they acquire that knowledge." Erdmer and Newby actually argue a little bit that this is kind of a digestible departure from behaviorism. It's not quite as subjective as constructivism, because it's still pretty teacher centered. They are still the source of the content, but it still has that edge of subjectivity because each student has a different mental cognitive process and cognitive abilities. In e-learning, it looks like we have to kind of settle it around a specific problem to solve or an essential question. That would work with both asynchronous or synchronous. But Clark says you got to use a variety of methods and media to establish this content. And you also have to allow for students to be assessed in different ways. If that's the case, we're really looking at different types of assessments. I'm pulling from the very controversial theory of multiple intelligences. Maybe someone's a music person or a kinesthetic person, etc. Whereas there's an established routine and rubric that's pretty open-ended on what the end is going to be. For e-learning, there's also a benefit that we don't get in the classroom, which is there's a freedom of progression. You could skip through stuff if you are cognitively able to do so, but you're also able to repeat if you have to. And I think that that's something that e-learning actually has a strength in. But the very important thing to include, and this is in a classroom setting, but also in this e-learning setting, would be to activate metacognition. How do you know? Think about what you did mentally to get to that point. And let's just say, for example, in that same APUSH class, I'm teaching continuity and change over time for political parties. First and foremost, my lesson is going to be it's going to include a very clear objective. if it's going to be an open-ended assessment, we still have to know what exactly I'm assessing on. I then would present a problem or essential question that must be answered as opposed to a specific skill. And I would probably have this problem be pretty theoretical or hypothetical. One thing I would think about to demonstrate changes in the Democratic Party would be, how would Andrew Jackson, the founder of the Democratic Party, a states' rights guy, how would he react to the policies of Lyndon Johnson or FDR, who were big government guys? That would have the students, demonstrate knowledge of all three of those presidents. But there's a lot of different ways that they can go about doing this, and so that's about how I would approach it. And then the assessment, of course, would be very open-ended: paper, presentation, visual, much like you're allowing us right now with this presentation. In conclusion, it looks like no matter what we're using, communication and feedback is absolutely crucial in modern education in general, especially with all the technology that is available to us, but in an e learning setting, especially so. But it looks like education, and this is just my experience, but also the result of this research, is moving towards a constructivist way of teaching and learning. We're not looking necessarily to replace behaviorism, but really to enhance behaviorism, making it, giving the cognitive load to the students or the teachers, the facilitator. But we still do see benefits in the behavioristic approach, and we are also looking at the sprinkling of additions, which is what I kind of call it, the sprinkling of the cognitivistic approach, specifically in the metacognition. It's super important and available, whether asynchronous or synchronous, to activate the metacognition of students. But after this research, I kind of see, why not all three? But let's have a deeper focus on constructivism. And I'm actually really interested in how technology becomes more and more available and accessible to include constructivistic approaches, especially with the advent of AR or virtual reality, where we could actually be at home, but virtually with someone else. And that would be interesting to see in the future. Here's my works cited, and thank you very much.